It's Wednesday, January 7th, 2009, and it's got to be 420 somewhere in the world. I'm your host, Radical Russ Belville. Produced and distributed by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C., this is your NORML Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Welcome to the most popular podcast regarding marijuana in all of America and all the world, featuring interviews with scientists, politicians, doctors, prohibition policy activists, regular cannabis consumers, musicians, and NORML staff and NORML's board of directors, along with music and comedy no other podcast can offer. You can always find out more about our show at our website, stash.norml.org, and continue the education and conversation on our blog as well. We're ending marijuana prohibition with education, one listener at a time. The podcasting and blogging technology for the NORML Daily Audio Stash is provided by Red Aphid Interactive Media. For your professional web design needs, visit redaphid.com. Good day, Stashers, and welcome to the podcast. Boy, I hope you're not all too disappointed with me having to miss the podcast yesterday, and right after a 5-day weekend. Boy, what's up with that? Well, turns out I've got another job, and that is I'm the host of the Russ Belville Show on XM Satellite Radio. We're a weekend progressive talk show, and my website, radicalruss.com, was the victim of a server crash, which hosts all my podcasts and other relevant blog posts and data. So I've spent the past 48 hours bringing everything back from backups and reconfiguring themes and so on. So I apologize for missing yesterday's podcast, but there was an emergency. For today's podcast, we're going to go right on ahead with our cannabis science and visit with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. We're going to talk a little bit about his book, A Parent's Guide to Marijuana, and a discussion on cannabis and schizophrenia. Does the heavy long-term use of cannabis lead to some sort of psychosis? Well, I think you know what the answer is, but we'll talk to Dr. Mitch about it coming up in Cannabis Science. Also, I've got an interview with Rusty Fleming, who is the director of a movie called Drug Wars, Silver or Lead, that takes a look at the corruption and violence that is spreading from Mexico into the United States from the battling Mexican drug cartels, and how 70% of their proceeds come from the trafficking of marijuana. As border communities begin to float the idea of legalization, Rusty says it's time that we have a reasoned debate on the issue. And I couldn't agree more. Plus, for your musical break today, I'm taking a request from a listener who had posted that one of his favorite songs wasn't in my top 10 for 2008. So I'm going to play that song for you today in our musical break. Also coming up in future Daily Audio Stash podcasts, remember that now that the legislatures have convened, both at the state and federal level, there's going to be plenty of activism and policy work to be done, and we'll be reporting on it here in our Government at Work segments. Next week, we'll be speaking with Ben Maisel from Wisconsin with a look at hemp and medical marijuana initiatives there, and we're always looking for more interviews from the activists, movers, and shakers at the local level all across these great United States and Canada. So if you know someone who should be on the Daily Audio Stash, send me an email at stash@norml.org. Also, don't forget we're rapidly approaching the deadline in our $10,000 pro-cannabis ad campaign. What should Obama do about pot? The deadline's coming up on January 15th. Stay tuned for our advertisement on the issue right after the hemp headlines. Okay, Stashers, we got a new government in office, and we've got a plant we got to get legalized. So buckle up and get ready. It's time for your NORML Daily Audio Stash.
Hello, I'm Paul Stanford from the Hemp and Cannabis Foundation, or THCF. Medical marijuana is legal in 13 states today, and THCF has clinics in 8 of those states. Our doctors help qualified patients obtain an authorization for medical marijuana in their state. Patients are eligible for medical marijuana with a history of either severe chronic pain and or nausea, cancer, AIDS or HIV, hepatitis, glaucoma, seizure disorders like epilepsy, chronic muscle spasms such as multiple sclerosis or asthma, neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, and gastrointestinal gastrointestinal disorders like IBS or Crohn's disease. If you or someone you know has one of these conditions, our doctors will help you obtain a permit for medical marijuana. THCF Medical Clinics has offices in Washington State, Oregon, California, Colorado, Hawaii, Nevada, Montana, and now Michigan. Call 1-800-723-0188 or go to the web at hemp.org or 1-800-723-0188.
Now it's time to take a look at the latest stories about marijuana from news organizations across America and around the world in our NORML daily audio stash, Hemp Headlines. CNN's Sanjay Gupta, what the next Surgeon General doesn't know about cannabis. The New York Times is reporting that Dr. Sanjay Gupta, a neurosurgeon and CNN health reporter, is the leading contender to become the next Surgeon General, a pick that will give the moribund office a higher profile, but one that has received a mixed reaction among public health advocates. If Dr. Gupta is picked for the post, he would be the nation's leading medical advocate. His experience in the media would be beneficial in bringing the Surgeon General's office back to the prominence it held when C. Everett Koop was successfully battling tobacco smoking. But is Dr. Gupta ready to deliver the Obama administration's promised end to the politicization of science and medicine? More specifically, will Dr. Gupta toe the federal line that cannabis is lacking in any medical value, or will he recognize what 13 states and the past 12 years of research prove, that cannabis is a beneficial medicine for some people and an intoxicant far less harmful than alcohol for others? In 2002, Dr. Gupta was more than willing to echo the outrageous claims that smoking pot would lead to psychosis, depression, and schizophrenia. But the 3 studies you were talking about talk specifically about schizophrenia and depression, and the fact that marijuana use earlier in life actually may lead to a 30% increase in schizophrenia later in life. Depression, also a very big diagnosis, roughly 18.8 million in the country have it. Again, they looked this time at 1,600 high school students and followed them over about 7 years. This is in Australia, not in the United States. But they actually found that all of these boys and girls, particularly girls, were more vulnerable to the symptoms of depression later on in life again if they were frequent or even daily marijuana users. 4 years later, in 2006, Dr. Gupta was penning this article, Why I Would Vote No on Pot, for Time magazine, as both Colorado and Nevada had non-medical cannabis regulation ballot measures pending. It doesn't seem like he's been following the past 2 decades of research. I'm constantly amazed that after all these years and all the wars on drugs and all the public service announcements, nearly 15 million Americans still use marijuana at least once a month. Frequent marijuana use can seriously affect your short-term memory. It can impair your cognitive ability. Why do you think people call it dope? And lead to long-lasting depression or anxiety. While many people smoke marijuana to relax, it can have the opposite effect on frequent users. And smoking anything, whether it's tobacco or marijuana, can seriously damage your lung tissue. But I'm here to tell you as a doctor that despite all the talk about the medical benefits of marijuana, smoking the stuff is not going to do your health any good. And if you get high before climbing behind the wheel of a car, you will be putting yourself and those around you in danger. Well, first I'd have to wonder what Dr. Gupta is amazed about, that 15 million Americans trust their own experiences with cannabis over the government's anti-drug propaganda and hyperbole. For a more in-depth look at the selection of Dr. Sanjay Gupta as Surgeon General, check out my post on what the next Surgeon General doesn't know about cannabis, online now at stash.normal.org. El Paso City Council says, let's talk about legalization. Mayor says no. From KDBC4 in El Paso, Texas. On Tuesday afternoon, El Paso Mayor John Cook vetoed a resolution unanimously passed by City Council that would have asked the U.S. government to begin a serious debate on legalizing narcotics. Earlier in the day, City Council passed a resolution rationalizing that the best way to stop the drug wars in Juarez may be to legalize the drugs here in the United States. It was part of a larger resolution outlining several steps for the United States and Mexico to take in order to cut down on the number of murders between rival drug cartels. Last year, more than 1,600 people were murdered in Juarez. City council members realize it may be extreme to legalize drugs like heroin, but others like marijuana could make sense. Currently, marijuana accounts for 70% of the drugs coming across the border. City Councilman Steve Ortega said, quote, "Any business will tell you, you take a 70% hit to your pocketbook, you're going out of business," end quote. Cook says he understands where the council members are coming from, but he's afraid El Paso would become a national laughingstock if he went to Washington and asked people like Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson to look into legalizing drugs. Said Cook, quote, "I don't think anybody thinks we should be able to run down to the corner drugstore and be able to buy heroin or cocaine or methamphetamines," end quote. The resolution is expected to be put back on the agenda next Tuesday. City Council can either overrule the veto with a supermajority vote or revise the resolution. The headline on this story tells you all you need to know about how the war on certain American citizens using non-pharmaceutical, non-alcoholic, tobacco-free drugs occupies a position in the public discourse that is considered unassailable. The City Council's resolution just asks the federal government to debate drug legalization, and the headline reads, quote, "Mayor Cook saves city from possible embarrassment," end quote. Because nobody serious would ever question the drug war. How embarrassing to have the gall to ask Senator Hutchinson to even think about investigating alternatives to spending $50 billion a year trying to stop people from using drugs. And notice how the mayor jumps right to corner convenience stores selling heroin, crack, and meth on the shelves as a model of legalization, when clearly the council was focusing on the 70% of Mexican drug traffic that is cannabis. Talk about embarrassing. Probably because the mayor realizes that in the western United States, there is majority support for taxing and regulating cannabis similar to alcohol and ending federal penalties for adult cannabis use. Rules for new medical cannabis program draw complaints. From the Detroit Free Press. The draft rules for the state's medical marijuana program treat users as criminals and put undue responsibility on law enforcement, say those who spoke at the only public hearing on the topic Monday in Lansing. More than 100 people gathered to voice concerns about regulations drawn by the Michigan Department of Community Health, which will oversee the program starting April 4th. Under the draft rules, registered users of marijuana for medical purposes or their caregivers would have to keep records of the amounts of marijuana they grow, and users would have to identify other users on registration forms. Some rules imposed actions not mentioned in the law, including requiring users to keep all marijuana under lock and key instead of just plants. Melissa DePiro of the Macomb County Office of Substance Abuse spoke in favor of the rule, adding that prescription drugs should be locked up as well. The requirement that patients would have to keep an inventory of how much cannabis they grow certainly would put patients at risk for federal prosecution. What U.S. attorney wouldn't want to have a nice, neat ledger of federal drug manufacturing activity to prosecute? Another of the proposed rules would define public view for the purposes of the law that requires patients to use out of public view. As proposed, public view would be so restrictive you couldn't use cannabis in your own home if the windows were open or on your back porch if your neighbor's 2-story home looks over your 8-foot privacy fence. Finally, I could actually support a measure that required cannabis to be kept under lock and key, so long as you're going to apply that standard to alcohol, tobacco, and prescription drugs too. But to think that a patient would be punished because children might get into her unlocked stash of cannabis when she had a bottle of Bacardi 151 in the cupboard, a pack of smokes on the coffee table, and a bottle of Darvocet in the bathroom medicine cabinet seems to be missing the point. Obama has been elected the 44th President of the United States. But will he bring us, the cannabis community, the change we can believe in?
It's an issue of doctors prescribing medical marijuana. I think that should be appropriate.
NORML is asking you to take action and help us hold President-elect Obama to his word with our $10,000 pro-cannabis law reform ad contest.
When I was a kid, I inhaled frequently. That was the point.
Just make a 30 or 60-second video or flash animation that answers the question, what should President Obama do about pot? You can submit as many entries as you like, and winning videos will be featured on NORML's website and television campaigns.
What I'm not going to be doing is using Justice Department resources to try to circumvent state laws on this issue.
The grand prize is $3,500, so enter early and enter often.
Well, I would not punish doctors if it's prescribed. That may require some changes in federal law.
Contest deadline is January 15th, 2009. Check NORML.org for official contest rules.
The war on drugs has been a utter failure, and I think that we need to rethink and decriminalize our marijuana laws.
President Obama, we couldn't agree more. Who is telling you the truth about marijuana? The government? Scientists? Doctors? Which claims are scientifically valid and which claims are reefer madness? Every Wednesday we separate the stems of propaganda from the buds of truth with NORML's look at cannabis science. All right, as is usual here on our Wednesday Daily Audio Stash, we like to sit down with Dr. Mitch Earleywine, who's an associate professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany, and also the author of the new book, Parents' Guide to Marijuana. Dr. Mitch Earleywine, welcome back to the Stash.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, let's start off with your book here, The Parents' Guide to Marijuana. I just got my copy here, and it's a nice book, about 100 pages, pretty easy to read, nice and conversational. Tell folks what you're trying to accomplish with this book.
The bottom line on this is a lot of folks my age, Russ, are having their kids come up and starting to ask about marijuana-related questions, and they get stuck in certain situations where they know they don't want their kids to use marijuana, but they know that the lies that they learned in the DARE program or in other educational efforts are clearly not something they want to repeat. And so I just walk through the literature and talk to them about, first of all, listening first, and then making sure that the kids get to ask all the questions they want to ask, and then disputing all the myths that we were all told about things like amotivation or the gateway theory, but then jumping right in with the data that really are pretty compelling about how marijuana in the developing brain is just not a good combination, and then without being alarmist, explaining that the possibility of lowering IQ or changing the way the brain is structured by smoking heavy really early in life is really there, and then listening to their teens and talking to them about things they can do as an alternative without having to say, oh, you're never going to touch this or you're going to go to hell.
Yeah. Now, I imagine a lot of parents also, we're talking about sometimes the baby boom generation here, talking to their teenagers about marijuana, and a lot of them, they dabbled a time or two or 3 or 12 when they were younger. How do you help a parent who's feeling like a hypocrite, perhaps, to try to tell their kid not to try marijuana when they were teenagers? They tried it and they didn't turn out so bad.
Well, the interesting thing is we didn't have the data back then. And so as much as I am, completely happy about folks using cannabis in their adult life, it really just isn't a good idea early in life because of some of these alterations in brain structure and the potential to decrease IQ. And this argument with teens about I'm the adult so I can do it, you're the teen, you can't, has never, won a whole lot of plugs from the younger folks. But I think drawing the distinction that later in life there's an opportunity to use this without any harm is a seed you can plant with them, and they'll never in an argument say, okay, you're right, fine, I won't. But I think what often happens, particularly if you're willing to listen to their side in a non-judgmental way, is you get them thinking about the idea that maybe this is something that they shouldn't do now. And if you're not saying you can never do it, but just I want you to wait until your brain is developed, for some reason they find that argument a little more compelling, a little more something that they can tolerate. And then, if you don't gloat, if you actually listen to them and hear their side and let them talk what they want to talk about, not only do they take home this message, but you're also really building your relationship. And you discover that, in fact, teens are delightful little people and that you have a really neat relationship with your own children. And in some ways, that's a buffer against all the problems that folks could have with marijuana early in life anyway. And so you've really laid a nice foundation for not just a little drug prevention program, but preventing problems in a whole bunch of domains.
Absolutely. Yes, I look back to my teenage years. I grew up, in the early 80s as a teenager, and I can tell you the method that doesn't work is the Nancy Reagan just say no method. You tell a teenager just say no, and the first thing they want to say is, oh, yeah?
Well, we had a big just say no on premarital sex in Missouri where I grew up, and so, of course, when I had a date, I often said, do you mind if we do X? You could just say no. Meaning they could say, no, they don't mind.
Well, yes. Now, another issue that a lot of parents are facing, especially, particularly in the states that have decriminalized or allowed the use of medical marijuana, is that we may have some parents who are using medical marijuana completely legally who have very young children. And how do you tell, getting away from the teenagers and talking about the very young kids, how can these parents explain their use of marijuana when the little kids are going to be getting the message that that's criminal and that's illegal in a lot of ways?
I've really been impressed with folks, even, 5 to 7 years old, getting the distinction between medicine and drug, illicit drug, pretty well. The other thing I'm finding just informally is folks who use the vaporizer, for some reason, their kids seem to see that as some kind of special instrument for the administration of medicine, whereas folks who are smoking joints are having a harder time making this argument, in part because that's sort of the way it's depicted at their drug schools, if you will, their little educational programs. Karen O'Keefe of Marijuana Policy Project and I did a big review of the states that have medical marijuana laws and those that don't, and there's actually no difference in teen and adolescent use when you compare those states. So I don't feel like this is a thing that should have a dramatic impact in some kind of weird negative way. And I think the other issue is when parents really emphasize the change in their symptoms. So I have a friend right now going through chemotherapy with kids, and she, gets really, really nauseated. And when they see her feel better, there's no way they're going to argue against something that's made, their mom basically capable of eating food and staying alive. And it's funny how just by sharing how you actually feel about the symptoms can really get them on your side in a way that nothing else could.
Yeah, and we want to encourage everyone out there listening, if you're a parent and you're looking for a way to talk to your kids about marijuana, this book is a definite help. The Parent's Guide to Marijuana. It's available out at Amazon.com. We've also got links to it up on our Stash blog at stash.normal.org. And Dr. Irwin, I can't let you go without attacking something that we talked about on last week's Stash. Another one of these alarmist headlines. When people see the word doctor with these reefer madness headlines, they tend to give it a little credence. And this was a story that came out of Toronto, Canada. This was a trial that's going on where a man was in a psychotic state and beat his girlfriend to death. And this doctor who got up on the stand to testify, his name was Dr. Stephen Hucker, said that it was highly likely that the guy was in a psychotic state, and that what was partially to blame for his psychotic state is, he says, his mental illness had been induced by chronic marijuana use. And he told the court that he was a daily user of marijuana, and that studies have determined that frequent users of cannabis have double the risk of developing mental illness or schizophrenia. So I thought we'd just throw that at you and see what you could do with that.
I sometimes just don't know where to begin with these anymore. It's really funny. Schizophrenia itself is an incredibly rare disorder and isn't at all doubled by the use of marijuana. And anybody who thinks that marijuana would cause aggression has obviously never smoked any, so it's just such a preposterous thing there. The bottom line on this mental illness literature is yeah, you do see some statistically significant increases in mental illness in folks who use marijuana really early in life, pretty heavy. But the increase is about a 40% increase. And then when you start looking at the way they've actually assessed this psychosis, you realize it's kind of a joke. So there are 5 studies now linking marijuana to something called schizotypal personality disorder, which is a kind of schizophrenia light, if you will, where you report some odd experiences or some weird beliefs. Well, I just never really believed it and looked at some of the items on the questionnaire for assessing schizotypal personality disorder and found that in my sample, yeah, the marijuana users were higher on these questionnaires, but there was one question that it turned out was biased against the cannabis users, and it was, I use words in unusual ways. Well, Russ, anybody who's ever busted a blunt at 420 with his homies is certainly going to say, I use words in unusual ways, and it has nothing to do with being psychotic. It just has to do with being part of a subculture, if you will, with its own slang. And the other studies along these lines are a little better done, but end up making some of the same curious mistakes. The other thing is there's a new study out actually showing that cigarettes has a 1.6, a 60% increase in mental illness when you look at the data very closely longitudinally, and I don't see anybody saying that cigarettes are causing anybody's mental illness and turning them to aggression or anything like that. The bottom line is, essentially, I don't think marijuana causes psychosis, but I think some psychotic people do smoke it, and that's how we've gotten basically cause and effect all confused yet again.
Yeah, that was always my interpretation sometimes of these studies, is this idea that how are you controlling for the fact that, you know, if you were a schizophrenic person, wouldn't you be more likely to want to try to quiet those voices somehow? Maybe they're self-medicating rather than the medication causing the psychosis.
Well, and in fact, some of the longitudinal studies have done a decent job at trying to control for that, but then they make some other mistakes in basically drawing such a wide net around what is psychosis that you realize a whole lot of people who shouldn't be labeled in the psychotic group end up in there anyway. The biggest meta-analysis that came out in the Lancet last year basically walks through 7 different studies and points out that basically 6 of the 7 didn't require any impairment at all. And I discussed this set of work at length on YouTube on my talk from the NORML conference last year. So if folks want to look that up, I go into pretty much detail about that literature, and I think they'll get a kick out of it.
Well, excellent. Dr. Earlywine, thanks again for joining us here every Wednesday on the Daily Audio Stash. And want to remind everyone we're still having our contest. If you'd like to win a copy of The Parent's Guide to Marijuana, we'll be giving away 3 free copies to people that send in their questions for Dr. Earlywine. So please send your questions to 420research@gmail.com, or you can send them directly to the stash here at stash@normal.org. We'll pick 3 questions for Dr. Earlywine to cover. So parents, if you've got questions about your children and marijuana, please send them in, and you could win a copy of The Parent's Guide to Marijuana. Dr. Earlywine, again, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next Wednesday on the Stash.
Looking forward to it.
It's tough talking to kids about marijuana, especially if you might be a parent who dabbled a time or two in your youth. So to help you out, get your copy of Dr. Mitch Earlywine's latest book, A Parent's Guide to Marijuana. Dr. Earlywine is an associate professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany and an expert on the studies concerning marijuana, its effect on health and society, and the methodology behind the statistics. He is a frequent guest here on our Daily Audio Stash. Dr. Earlywine lays it all out without the propaganda and scare tactics that parents know won't work with teenagers. He presents a rational understanding of cannabis, what it is and what it isn't, and why kids shouldn't be using marijuana. You can order today through Amazon.com or check our links at our blog, stash.normal.org. Here at the NORML Daily Audio Stash, we work hard to change our nation's marijuana laws through education and discussion. But we also take time to relax and unwind with an eclectic mix of pod-safe music from many independent artists. We look for music that speaks to the growing truth about cannabis, or music that speaks to broader themes of freedom, liberty, social justice, equality, and protest. To find out more about the artists and download the music you hear on this podcast, just log on to stash.normal.org. And if you'd like to get your music heard by the online cannabis community, just send us an email at stash@normal.org. Never let it be said that I do not take requests. Responding to my top 10 stash tunes I played here in 2008, a stasher by the Cheney-esque name of Evil Dick writes, I would like to say that of all the songs I've heard on the podcast, Tomas, Let's Get High, is my favorite. That is artwork. Damn good stuff. Indeed, I played Tomas way back on March 4th, 2008, back when I was only 3 weeks into my new gig as a podcast host. You're right, Dick. This is some damn good stuff. Tomas Proetsis was born in Greece and lived in Germany as a child. He now lives in New York, where he continues to develop his jazzy, funky, soulful style. Check him out on his MySpace page, which we have a link to on our blog at stash.normal.org. And now, it's Tomas with Let's Get High.
Stay in one place, so I roam in front of me. A long distance, I've got to go, I've got to breathe. And when I stop to sit beside the fence, I need time out before I drop. Where are you? You gotta give me your hand. Turn every old into new. Let's get high. Ride through the rainbow. Let the stars pass me by. Let's get high. And if we get down, we'll give it another try. Lord, give us another try. I'm sick of lies. Don't fool yourself. There's one condition for the prize. Right now I need a healing hand to cure my soul before I bleed. And then the sun will meet the moon. There is a chance to get it done. In 69 we will succeed. About space, about time. Let's get high. high. Right through the rainbow, let the stars pass me by. Let's get high. And if we get down, we'll give it another try. Let's get high. Right through the rainbow, let the stars pass me by. Let's get high. And if we get down, we'll give it another try.
76% of Americans no longer support arresting and jailing marijuana smokers, and nearly as many support the medical patients having access to medical marijuana. And over 80% of our citizens now believe the war on drugs is an ineffective failure. So the question is, when will the government's misguided war on adult marijuana smokers finally end? When? Simple. When you and your like-minded friends, family, and coworkers get involved with an organization such as the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, also known as NORML. My name is Keith Stropp, and I founded the organization in 1970. Contact us at NORML, toll-free, 888-67-NORML, or by visiting the organization's up-to-date webpage at www.norml.org.
Today here on the NORML Daily Audio Stash, we're taking a look at a fantastic new documentary out called Drug Wars, Silver or Lead. And you got to check this out. It's at www.drugwarsthemovie.com. It's an amazing documentary about what's happening on our southern border with respect to this war on drugs. Today we're speaking to the man behind the movie, Gary Fleming. Gary, welcome to the Daily Audio Stash.
Hi, Russ. Good to be here.
This is a subject that has come up in a number of stories we've published here on the Stash. Recently, we talked to, we looked at a story coming from the Arizona Attorney General, and recently also El Paso City Council talking about legalizing marijuana as a way to deal with this epidemic in Mexico. And a lot of people kind of snickered at that idea, but down there on the border, this is some serious talk. What is happening that is bringing these people to the idea of possibly legalizing marijuana?
Yeah, and let me just tell you, I mean, I think you can clearly see over the last 37 years what isn't working. And the way we've been prosecuting the war on drugs is a failed policy. And the issue has not gotten better, it's actually gotten worse. And, you know, I think there's a couple of different ways to look at this and a couple of different perspectives. And I guess the one that I personally can speak about is to do the documentary and the book that I've published, I went inside of one of the cartels for about a year. And I, through that and through my research and interviewing other people, experts on both sides of the border, I came to the realization that the business model from which these criminal organizations operate under derive 60 to 70% of their bottom line profits from the sale of marijuana alone. And when you look at that and you just simply put it in simple terms of ripping 60 to 70% off of any Fortune 500 company's bottom line, that's going to bring them to their knees. I mean, they're not going to stop. It's not going to prevent the violence. It's not going to prevent the overwhelming amount of cocaine and heroin and other drugs that come into this country. But what it is going to do, it's going to make these huge criminal organizations completely revamp how they do business. And you would probably do more in a positive stride on the war on drugs by making that one move than anything we've done collectively over the last 37 years.
And this is, you know, of epidemic proportions down in Mexico along the northern border with these cartels fighting for the control of the trafficking routes. And we're talking about decapitations and terrorism and assassinations and violence and corruption on a massive scale, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. And And Russ, let me just, tell you, it has not stopped at the border. This is happening inside the United States, well into the United States. The cartels have made a tremendous stride in taking over the retail sales of narcotics inside the United States. And they have got cell groups and sometimes multiple cells in practically every major metropolitan city in the country. And they're not sending over Mexican nationals to do this. They're using Americans to do this. They're recruiting from the prison. They're recruiting from American street gangs, and they're recruiting kids right out of school to be their operatives right here in the States. And, for Middle America to think that this is a Mexican problem or a border issue, they're dead wrong. This is something that's affecting all of us throughout the entire United States.
And it's the money involved here, which has just grown to such enormous proportions because of A, the prohibition against drugs and specifically marijuana, and B, the American appetite for marijuana specifically that hasn't gone down at all.
No. And Russ, I've never been one to embrace the legalization issue. I'm a recovering addict myself, and well before I got involved in investigating the cartels. And I just have to tell you that what I am promoting at this point is a serious debate. It's time for us to have a mature discussion about this. And, there are some really smart people out there that have gamed out these scenarios. And, I think it's time to bring it to the forefront and let the American people decide what they want to do about this. Because we're never going to arrest our way out of this problem. We're never going to build enough prisons. And, not only, you also have to look at this, not only do we, do the cartels have 60 to 70% of their bottom line derived from this, but you look at what the resources that law enforcement, both on the federal, state, and even local levels, have to dedicate towards the pursuit and prosecution of crimes related to marijuana, and you're talking about that same number. It goes from 40 to 70%. That's a big number. And we could rededicate those resources towards the pursuit and prosecution of the other drugs, cocaine, heroin, and meth, and so many other drugs, and so many other crimes. And it would do more for our country in one fatal swoop than anything else we've ever done. There are some serious people talking about this now. I've talked to members of Capitol Hill. I'm talking to Texas legislators. I'm talking to members of the academic society. I'm talking about presidents of universities, major universities in this country. And they are all, opening up the discussion about the legalization issue.
Yeah.
And I think it's time.
I agree. And I think that's what's the important thing to point out here is that this needs to move from not talking about it at all to at least having the discussion.
Right.
I'm reminded of this headline here that I just reported on from El Paso, talking about the mayor vetoing the city council's recommendation to have the discussion. And the headline actually said, Mayor Cook saves city from possible embarrassment, as if bringing up the issue is in itself just so unserious, so silly that it would be an embarrassing thing to talk about. And I'm glad that your documentary here comes out and helps to show people that not talking about it is what's causing these problems.
Exactly. And you're exactly right. That is just wrong-headed thinking that, even bringing up the discussion. And I'm telling you, I have talked to seasoned law enforcement professionals whose first knee-jerk reaction to any kind of legalization has been absolutely not. And when they watch this film and they see firsthand what we're really up against, it causes them to pause, and many of these guys have now called to say, hey, look, if you guys really want to get serious about talking about this, I'm on board with talking about it. And I truly believe that you're going to see this year, this calendar year, a serious discussion about this issue. And, I think that once all the facts are laid on the table, I think the American people are smart enough to decide for themselves. I'm not particularly crazy about letting Congress decide this on their own. I'm not so sure that a referendum doesn't need to be drawn up and let the American people vote this.
That's one of the things I'd like to also point out here too, is that I think part of the reason why these people take the notion of legalization as something that's not worthy of serious discussion is because they always come at it from the notion that it's cut and dried, that it would be like buying it at the convenience store model, without any thought to the idea that legalization's a pretty broad term and could encompass all sorts of regulatory schemes for making sure that we have adults only use, that we're controlling the amounts of that are being possessed or being distributed in a much better way than when we let the criminal gangs take care of it.
Right. And you know, I think that, you know, there were two people that I included in my documentary, Norm Stamper and Suzanne Wills, and they make a very compelling argument about that very issue, about the government reclaiming its control over all drugs. And, you know, again, I have to tell you that I'm not an advocate for legalization, but I am an advocate for having the discussion and letting all the facts bear themselves out. And, you know, I see it as a very urgent issue from the standpoint of we're allowing these criminal gangs and their power to influence and corrupt well beyond Mexico. We need to grow up. It has. The only way these guys can proliferate and expand is through corruption of governmental and law enforcement elements, and they're doing it in mass numbers. And, you know, to blame it all on the Mexicans is an immature, intellectually lazy argument.
Yeah.
And it's our problem, and we have to deal with this. And, you know, there's not I even say this in my documentary, there's not a rehab in the world that lets an addict blame his dope dealer for his problem. America has the demand. And we have more demand in this country for narcotics than any other country on the planet. We need to recognize that and deal with it from that angle.
Yeah, that's always surprised me, especially when you're speaking to politicians who always espouse market ideologies of supply and demand, always trying to attack the supply without ever trying to attack the demand.
Exactly.
Well, Rusty, this is a great film, and again, I want to remind everybody the name. It's Drug Wars, Silver or Lead. You can find out more about it at drugwarsthemovie.com. We'll have a link for that up on our blog at stash.normal.org. And Rusty, thank you so much for doing this work and bringing along the idea that we should at least have a serious discussion about this drug war.
Okay. Thanks, Russ.
Thanks, Rusty. Appreciate it so much. Thank you for downloading the NORML Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. We are produced by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C. Our executive producer is Alan St. Pierre. Our deputy director is Paul Armentano. Our webmaster is Brian Judy, and web production is provided by Red Aphid Interactive Media. As always, you can catch up on the latest information about marijuana at www.norml.org. And you can interact and download from our Audio Stash blog at stash.normal.org. For everyone here at NORML, I'm your host, Radical Russ Belville, hoping all your harvests are bountiful and your encounters with law enforcement are non-existent. We leave you today with a cannabis quote from an op-ed written in the Fort Myers, Florida Weekly just this week. This said, quote, "Imagine that marijuana could be taxed at exorbitant rates, 100% even, in exchange for granting legalization of the plant. Our hypothetical modest $30 million could begin to build a comprehensive world-class transportation system. It could be used to build a municipal super high-speed internet system that makes broadband speeds look tortoise-like. A system like that would show big technology firms that Southwest Florida means business. We could fund educational programs and scholarships that would make us a magnet for the greatest minds in the nation." End quote. And as more and more states are going to be facing the back end of this Wall Street crisis, you can bet they're going to be looking for innovative ways to fund programs. I'm Radical Russ. Make sure you call your state legislatures and make a little suggestion. Legalize it. Tax it. We'll see you next time, everybody, and until then, take care of each other, tokers.